Hello, Alex. I'm one of the staff members. Murat,
Hi there.
Ruralist. Hi, how are you? I just launched the meeting. Krista will be joining soon. We are just testing things out, making sure that 15 minutes earlier, everybody has access together.
Nice to meet you. How are you?
Good, good, good. How things are going so far? This is our first time trying something like this. So like, you know, we are trying to like learn the process as well. I think except the first day, we have been running things like smoothly. First day we had some kind of like issues, but we'll see.
I'm glad we're not on the first day then.
Yes. So what I'm told is like everybody will have a chance to like join the session 3 minutes before it actually starts. So like until I guess we have about 10 minutes, 9 minutes before everybody joins. We are just testing things out, hoping Krista will join like shortly. And we won't start the recording before the session starts. That's the info that I have.
And you know, so I'm not sure about the format. Will people be asking, like, will Krista be asking us questions, and then does it go to sort of everybody else in a live format, or will they be typing in their questions?
My understanding is they will be typing, and like only the moderators and Krista will have access to like unmute, like, you know, yourself and speak. That's how it's going to go. But I think we also have a chance to like unmute everybody. One of my job will be also like, you know, if somehow like somebody like, you know, unmutes themselves and start talking, I'll go to that person, like, you know, mute that person. So like,
there's
I'll
always
make sure that, I'll make sure that like you will have the clean kind of like an environment. I'll drop a like, you know, Teams message to Krista just to make sure that like we are on, by the way.
I had a feeling you were going to wear a light sweater over a collared shirt, Ziggy. I didn't know that we would be both wearing nice
it's a uniform. What can I
related
say?
Yeah.
It's starting to get chilly, so
I don't know if this is a jewel tone or a pastel. I think it's probably neither, but it's, I don't know what the right color category this is, but how was your trip to Europe, by the way? I know that was a little while ago, but
it was good. I managed to spend almost the entire August there, which meant working from Denmark, which in the past has been not easy because of the time difference. But this time actually was easy because of the time difference. I made everything work and still spend time with my family. So it worked out.
Hey, congratulations.
And Denmark is not, you know, nobody wears masks there because they have things pretty tight under control, and they test like crazy. And they have caught up and surpassed the US on vaccination rates.
Yeah, testing is a big, you know, hole in our strategy for sure.
Yeah, we have like, so Denmark, there were open test centers in just about everywhere. And previously you had to, everybody have like an ID, and it's all like digital passport, and you can add tests to it, and it's all like very centralized and rational, and you have to set up appointments before, and you don't even need to do that anymore. Just go in, get it taken. And
cool.
You can choose between your PCR or your rapid test.
That's great.
It's all free, yeah.
Man.
Yeah. Yeah, the testing is what allowed them to basically do away with masks. So there are some places where they do require proof of vaccination or recent test, like some restaurants and establishments. But even in those, you don't wear a mask.
Hmm.
So,
Interesting.
yeah. The only
Krista,
way to have-
welcome.
Oh, hi, Krista.
Thank you. I was going to check for lettuce in my teeth, but I mean,
That's good.
we're all friends here, so you can tell me.
Oh, I didn't know.
It was great.
I didn't
Anything
know I
else
was
we need to
supposed
do? I need to do, Krista. I'm sorry, like, Ziggy, like anything else I need to do other than like starting the session? I'll try to make sure like unmute people if they speak, but you are set. Everything else, Krista, just shoot me or hold me.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the one thing we talked about is when Alex, Ziggy, and I are talking for the first 20 minutes to spotlight all three of us, so folks can see who's talking, and maybe they'll have their screen set up in speaker view or whatever they call it in Zoom. Yeah, so that we'll sort of fill the screen, and then the recording we fill the screen.
Okay,
And
I'll try.
then,
I think it's automatic. As far as I know, it's automatic. It's once somebody speaks, it should
yeah,
kind of like,
well, it does. So there's an aspect to it that's automatic, but spotlighting adds like that yellow line around
Okay.
the video and makes it more findable if people have it in gallery view. And I think Emily gave you instructions on how to do that.
She
I
has
think
not,
it's
but
in
I'll
the-
figure it out. Okay, no
Yeah, I
problem.
think it's in the three little dots to the right of
Okay, Got
the
it.
speaker's picture. And let me just test my screen share right fast, if that's okay. So I plan to show this, like when we come in. Where's the full screen? Here. So when we, yeah, that looks good. Ziggy, I wish we had a better picture for you. Sorry, we used your LinkedIn, and then I think we used the higher res picture you sent us on the website.
Uh-huh.
Is that looking okay?
It's fine.
Okay.
I feel very blurry today, so that's fine.
Oh, I don't want to make that feeling more pronounced. But anyway, we can have this, if y'all are okay with it, we'll have this when as folks come in, and we can play the music or not. You want to hear that? We can do it or not. How do you turn it off? Oh, geez. I don't know how to turn it off. Murad, help me. Okay, this is leveraging. I'll start over for the benefit of the recording. Welcome to Digital Supports for Rural Places, Leveraging Broadband Planning for Economic Development Strategy and Pandemic Recovery. I'm Krista Vinson, and I lead the Broadband and Infrastructure pillar at Ruralist. Today, I'm so pleased to have the chance to introduce you to two experts in broadband infrastructure planning who have worked in rural communities across the country to solution for robust connectivity. Ziggy Rivkin-Fish is the Vice President for Broadband Strategy at CTC Energy and Technology, where he specializes in project management and process planning. Since 2005, he has served as the lead manager for all phases of deployment of NCRNet, the Interoperable Public Safety Communication Network in the National Capital Region around Washington, D.C. Welcome, Ziggy. And welcome, Alex. Alex Kelly leads Rural Innovation Strategies, Inc. / Center on Rural Innovations efforts to help communities plan new fiber networks by building feasibility models, creating business plans with capital stacks that take advantage of state and federal subsidies. I know that's really on everybody's minds today, and devising partnership structures that align with incentives of public and private entities. Alex's career before joining RISI was split between professional services in Silicon Valley and rural organizing and political strategy. Welcome, Alex.
Thanks, Krista.
And yeah, the rural team has really benefited greatly from the counsel and experience of Ziggy, Alex, and their respective teams, supporting us as we shape this pillar strategy, which is really just a year old for Ruralist. And our vision for the broadband and infrastructure portfolio is that its solutions, like our other pillars, is part of a layered, integrated, and strategic rural development approach where high-speed internet is a means to an end. At the community level, this includes expanded workforce development opportunities, small business growth opportunities, and a chance to direct rural places' future in a globalized economy driven by technology change. And really at the individual level, where Ruralist and LISC as organizations have worked for our entire history, this includes more reliable access to the social safety net, a chance to improve skills, and access to better health. And many of the other topics I'm sure we'll discuss as this hour progresses. As you've heard throughout the conference, Ruralist is committed to achieving spatial equity and serving the most underserved. When it comes to broadband, however, one size does not fit all in rural, and yet the common denominator of any successful broadband deployment is equity. Equity of access, equity in affordability, and equity in knowledge and skills. And we'll talk about that today. Here's a little more of the rural digital equity strategy, which is still evolving and will continue to evolve with your help. So we really envision our digital equity solution as a means to achieve economic mobility. And COVID really brought that to light, which is why Ruralist took on this program area, which previously had not been one of our strategic priorities. And so far we've fashioned several solutions, which are laid out on this slide, to train digital navigators to help people gain and sustain tech literacy and access to low-cost connectivity and devices that support their respective goals. We've offered emergency cash grants through all of our digital navigator program partners to help clients purchase appropriate devices or subsidize a home internet connection, which was essential during the emergency part of the pandemic and really is an important part of this solution going forward. Although we're sort of flexible in what the definition of inclusion means, and we'll talk about that. We've produced a guide for CDFI loan officers and affordable housing developers on integrating appropriate digital technology design criteria into a project budget and building design, and look forward to releasing a digital copy of this report later in the year. And lastly, really the bulk of the conversation today is around our expanding work in supporting multi-jurisdictional broadband planning and capacity building, including on native lands, to aid rural broadband expansion and identify a clear path to funding and digital equity outcomes. The Digital Navigator program is a bit further along in terms of our progress to date. We've had a successful cohort of 9 sites in the Appalachia region participate through March of this year and continue to find additional resources to bring those solutions to their markets. We launched a Southern region strategy in the spring of this year, which will continue through the end of this year, covering 11 states plus some bonus region Ruralist partners that were ready to take on this work and sort of adopt this portfolio. And we're certainly looking for additional allies to deliver this program in that way through independent resources. And finally, over the summer, we launched our Midwest region strategy with Microsoft's philanthropy support, and that work will continue into April of next year. And the goal with Digital Navigator is to deploy devices to help subsidize or engage individual households in public benefits like emergency broadband benefit and Lifeline, so that they have access to affordable connectivity. And really the bulk of the conversation today to increase rural broadband access, sometimes through LISC grant making, and ultimately through advisory services that lead to communities being able to identify sustainable sources of funding to deploy entirely new networks or to expand network capacity. And what's the goal? The goal is to demonstrate that digital inclusion is essential to the social safety net, and we are finding that we're promoting a model that's getting attention from practitioners and policy advocates, which is helpful at a time when these issues are very much being debated at the federal level, and we'll see these issues emerge as top priorities in state governments and localities, as we'll discuss. And ultimately, the biggest end goal is support for sustainable regional economies that through access to technology are really able to move forward cohesively and productively in growing their local places. So with that, I would love to stop sharing and start the dialogue with Alex and Ziggy. I'll ask them each a couple of questions to frame this discussion over the next couple of minutes, and then really want to spend the bulk of the time hearing the questions that the audience or success stories and comments that the audience may have, and give you all a chance to hear from folks who really do have this breadth of experience. So if you're ready to go, Ziggy, Alex, to get us started, my first question is really how to get started with broadband planning, and what are some of the successful ingredients or some of the ingredients that make for a successful outcome?
Alex, you want to go first, or you want me to?
Yeah, sure. I'll go first. I'll take us part way there, and then you can jump in. Hi, everyone. So good to be here. So great question. And I think what I would have said before the pandemic in response to what do you do first is make sure all the decision makers in your community are aligned on the fact that broadband and broadband gaps are a challenge worth tackling. I actually don't think that's much of an issue anymore, which is great because of what we've all lived through with having to work remotely and learn remotely. And I think what we've seen is that the challenges of the pandemic have created a context in which there's immense momentum behind fixing broadband, and it's bipartisan, and you see more money going to it than ever, and regulations changing to enable it. So instead, I think my piece of advice for the very first place to start is to make sure that you have full alignment and awareness and involvement with the kind of suite of movers and shakers and stakeholders in your community that will need to be involved. I think when we as kind of rural consultants who help people through this process start a project, and everyone from the select board or a board of aldermen to municipal managers, county mayors, local mayors, business leaders, if the biggest point of challenge that we have is when there are communities where not everyone's in the loop and united behind this project, because it really does take a full community effort to get this stuff done. So that, I think, is the very first step that I would recommend. But there are certainly more. Ziggy, why don't you jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. In general, there's also been a shift in the type of and the amount of funding that's available, and it's really a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. So yes, there's a sense of a crisis that's not going to continue, and so that needs to be capitalized on. And there is, for the next few years, hopefully with infrastructure bill passing as well, or some version of it passing, there will be additional broadband funding. And I agree, get local authorities involved. It's generally speaking not that difficult to get them interested in the infrastructure piece, especially if they feel it and they know it, because they're going to get a lot of upset people knocking on their doors. So yes, get the local government and decision makers involved and on the same page. But sometimes some convincing needs to be done. They are not always certain about what kind of funding they might have to pony up with, and if they have it. And so part of it sometimes is a bit of an education effort and saying, yes, there's a problem and here's how big it is, which means you have to do some mapping, you have to do some data searching. If you have an experienced consultant, fantastic. If you feel you can undertake it yourself, that's great. But data is key. If you want partners later to help with the infrastructure piece, they need to know things on the ground, like, well, what's served, what's unserved, what are the potential competitors? Am I building in a place in anticipation of like an 80% take rate because people are starving for broadband, or do they have a less than optimal DSL solution, but it's cheap and a fair number of them will hold on to that, so my take rate is going to be low. These are things I would want to know as a provider. If I need to construct, I want to know where there are poles are in a horrible place, the condition, and really like half of them need to be replaced. So really underground is the best way to go, but there are some areas with rock, like very rocky soil, and so I may need a more expensive and drill to do that, and that'll increase my cost. Those are having that data available so your partners can run with it. The other thing I would say is this is really an opportunity to bring the digital inclusion piece, the sort of broader barriers to adoption in and mesh with the infrastructure piece. Where do we have gaps in existing infrastructure? The current recent guidelines that the Department of Treasury released for the capital projects funds underline affordability as something that should be taken into account when looking at projects for infrastructure builds. So, and this is why you should be talking to your local authorities too, because they should be talking to their state. That funding goes to the state, and the state has to develop a process by which to select projects that qualify or are eligible according to Treasury's guidelines, which means you should be getting in front with the local authorities, because they are the ones that will carry weight here, with them to the state authorities and lobby them to make sure that your kind of project gets funded and you have the opportunity to pitch one. And if they provide any kind of funding, which some do, for planning projects, this may be your opportunity to say, if you don't already have it, establish a quick, sub-grant program that just throws us $50,000, $60,000, $80,000 with maybe some match required for us to get a plan underway and get some of the mapping done, get some of the good advice. What partner strategy might work? Could the county or municipality undertake their own build, or is this really nobody has appetite for that kind of stuff, and they really want to go to the private ISPs and just subsidize it enough so that it becomes economically viable? Those are the kind of things that you want to hash out.
Yeah, I think an undercurrent to what Ziggy's been saying, which is absolutely right, is that it's a complicated process planning for infrastructure. And so to kind of riff on what Ziggy's saying, another thing that I would do is once you get your stakeholders together who are going to be part of the process, start familiarizing yourself with published material on how this usually goes so that you can start preparing to engage a consultant or preparing to look around corners. And we could certainly spend a full hour on what is the process and all the permutations. Perhaps in a nutshell, I would say the process involves kind of, doing a gap assessment to determine the need in the community, creating a financial model and a design model to think about how you could fill those gaps, finding partners that need to be involved and are willing to be involved in executing, and then taking all of that and matching it against an eligible funding source, whether that be a federal subsidy program, a state program, municipal bonds where that's eligible, or another source of funding. So it's kind of, do the technical stuff and the financial stuff, match it against a partner or partners that are willing to participate in the solution, and then make sure based on all of that, you can access and you're eligible for the funding that you need to get it done. So to the extent you can familiarize yourself to that process in more detail than we're able to go into today is great, and just makes for a much smoother and faster start out of the starting gate when you inevitably start working on this.
Thank you both so much. A lot of great advice there. This is recorded and can be revisited later. And to your point about detail, Alex, I was going to save our pitch for the end of the session, but why not bring it up at the front, which is that this is how Ruralist is trying to be a resource to our communities in helping to pay for some of those pre-development costs that were referenced, such as the mapping activities. If a state program does not have planning or feasibility funding, Ruralist is looking to step in. So I would really love to hear from the audience if you've already sort of launched those inquiries and are aware of whether or not that's a funding gap in your area, and if Ruralist can be part of the solution. We heard a lot from Ziggy and Alex just now. One of the things that I want to emphasize is you both use the term process, and the insinuation being that this can be a lengthy process in which real effort to sustain the momentum must be made. And honestly, that's something that we heard in all the sessions at the seminar today. In particular, the conversation with the White House and Brookings, Tony Pippa from Brookings, mentioned that the CARES Act was really put forward as relief money. And now as we look to ARPA and to the pending infrastructure bill, some caution was offered to be realistic about the amount of time it takes to build, for communities to grow the capacity, deploy the investment, including broadband, probably especially broadband. And though some will look for quick results at the local level, the state level, the congressional level, it was suggested that we should all be honest about what it will take to develop a funding strategy, kind of a program of work to deliver this economic or community development solution, particularly broadband. I can hear already that resonates with you, but I wonder what you would add to that. And Ziggy, if I may, it would be helpful, I think, for the audience to understand that the mechanics of these dollars and sort of the stakeholders or primary actors in the ARPA regime or the pending infrastructure program will look a little bit different than, say, by comparison, the FCC's RDOF program, which just kind of completed a phase of work only a couple of months ago.
Yeah, so the federal government has used different mechanisms for spurring broadband. So prior to the pandemic and the money that sort of started accumulating quickly, there were two chief programs that subsidized especially rural areas, well, almost exclusively rural areas, I should say. One was the FCC's high cost program, and the other one was sorry, USDA's Reconnect program. Reconnect program is a standard capital expenses grant program. Like, you apply, here's where I want to build. I can demonstrate that this is unserved, and in Reconnect, I have to, typically the local government partners with an ISP, and they submit the proposal together. Sometimes the ISP is also a local government, but in most cases that was not the case there, and it was kind of built to prefer public-private partnerships, and so you got capital. If you won the award, you got money to deploy, which heavily subsidized what it would cost for an ISP to build something with return on investment in mind. In rural areas, obviously, the economics just doesn't work unless you sort of fill in with funds. The other approach, the high cost approach that FCC took, is a model in which you look at areas that are hard to serve because they're remote, and extending and operating is costly. So the FCC, with a very complex algorithm, estimated what it would cost in each census block to extend infrastructure and how much support would be needed for somebody to come in and offer the service. So, and then there are various different funding mechanisms they use, but in the big one, it was the Connect America Fund auction, and the successor to that completed last year, which was Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, which is just a renaming essentially of that. And in that scenario, you are bidding on the amount of support that you are willing to get from the government, or how little you'll get away with, how little you can get and still get the money without somebody outbidding you and saying, well, we can do it for just 15% of what's available. Hey, we can do it for 10%. And then eventually there'll be a winner, and they will be receiving money for the next 10 years on a monthly basis. So that, it's a different calculation for providers of what works in a capital grant type program. If you are a smaller provider, getting that upfront capital makes a difference, because you may not be able to, and this goes for local governments too, it may be difficult for you to carry a debt burden for a long period of time. RDOF tends to, these auction types where your subsidy is over a longer period of time, does tend to favor larger, well-capitalized companies or technologies that are relatively inexpensive to deploy, although they might be expensive to operate, because you can get the subscriber base as you deploy to cover those. So fixed wireless, for example, does fit in that category. So FCC put all kinds of controls in place in the auction to make sure that it didn't go, all the money didn't go to fixed wireless, but that's another story. But there are different mechanisms for funding, different logics on the infrastructure side. And then of course we have the new programs that subsidize subscription costs. So here the assumption is you have options on your connectivity, but you may not be able to afford it. What can the government do to help? And in some programs, it's directly to the consumer, and in others, it goes to the ISP.
Mm-hmm. That was very helpful. I see, Matt, you have your hand raised. If you'd like to go ahead and ask a question, because that was topically related, and then I'll direct one to you, Alex.
Yeah, it's kind of more of an observation, I guess. We all, we've all seen the dollars that are available to help expand broadband into the rural areas of the country. And we have a lot of the community champion programs that are going on, trying to create the community champions in these rural communities. But I think what we see a lot, and what I've found a lot is in particular in the rural sites, these folks wear a lot of hats, and they get bogged down on higher priority issues that come along, and they don't know what they don't know when they're dealing with the service provider or dealing with the government that they might be, their state or local government, they might be asking for funding, et cetera. What type of resources, if any, maybe from a consultancy standpoint even, do you know about or have you heard about that can, while we have the community champion, somebody that kind of picks up and carries the torch along the way? So when you talk about an ISP says, well, I want to put fiber in the ground, and it's going to take 5 years to do that. And if they were willing to do fixed wireless and could get it done in 12 months, who makes that, somebody that can make that case and make that argument for the local community, so that broadband is expanded in a more rapid fashion?
Yeah, Ziggy, can you give an example? And then Alex, you no doubt have examples of how local stakeholders energize the process, especially, nonprofits, how they would hold the center. So Ziggy, Alex?
Well, I don't know which ones I can talk with specifically, but we certainly do have. I have to say that we have not had many such cases. Usually when they come to us, and I understand that with a sort of community activist, that might look different because they didn't start with broadband necessarily as the driving issue, whereas we get solicited with with folks that go, oh my God, we're desperate, help us, we need broadband. So half the battle is already won. But we definitely have areas in which it's a nonprofit that's spearheading the effort and it's dragging the local government along. And so what we have built into our process is sort of building a case for that government to ensure that they understand, so they can understand why this is important in the first place. Oftentimes, they're not even certain that there is a problem. I mean, they've been told by Comcast that the whole area is served. And then there are some people saying no, but then they go back to Comcast and Comcast says, look at our maps, it's all served. And they're like, there's no problem. And so going in and showing there is a problem and it's critical and it's your economic development really is suffering. And then in these days, what is happening is that suddenly their neighbors are deploying broadband and they go, oh, wait, what's going on? We're being left behind. And so their priorities start changing. Thankfully, there are funding sources coming down the line, include especially Capital Projects Fund, which are dedicated to broadband. So those funds are not in a competition with other infrastructure priorities. So the extent to which you can get in front of your state government and say, help us do this study, or we've already engaged somebody to do the study. We just wanted to let you know, are there any things you want us to keep in mind as we embark on this? And just keep us in mind, make sure that our project is fundable and eligible. You know, that's the way I would do it. So yes, you're right. There are some places where you need to do a business case for the decision makers. And it's not unheard of, by the way, that even where you were commissioned in a rural or non-rural community, it was because there was one commissioner who was especially passionate about it, and that commissioner needs the case to be presented to the others. And usually that goes well. At least that's my experience.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I think the other thing that I would add is that, at least as part of our process, we understand the need to include as much education about broadband, about technologies, about the decisions, about the process of kind of our clients as possible, so that they, first of all, the process is a long process. We're not going to be able to stick around for 2 years, helping people through it. We need to empower our clients to know how to take things forward and make decisions and understand the trade-offs between the fixed wireless and the fiber or whatever other decisions come along the way. So when you work with someone, hopefully they're not just simply dropping off a report that then you can put on a shelf. If you try to be involved in the process as much as possible and meet with them weekly and ask questions and really gain the information that you need so that you can carry the project forward after the kind of planning work is done. Because I think to your original question, Krista, this is not a quick process. It's not a quick process in ordinary times. I mean, planning a feasibility study and a business plan can take 8 months or something like that. There's other factors like how accessible the data is. Negotiating a partnership can take months, if not a year, especially when you get lawyers involved and have to iron out contractual details. And on top of that, at the moment, there's a 12-month lead time on certain types of fiber and materials, depending on the strand count. There's a 14-month lead time on bucket trucks if you need those. I mean, there's a lot going on right now. That means that there's no time like the present to get started, but setting expectations with the community and with all the stakeholders about how long this actually is going to take is important, because it doesn't happen overnight.
Let me ask a follow-up question to that, and then I want to invite Don to ask his question, or I can read it out from the chat. what is effective as far as local leaders engaging their state broadband offices? And some are very new, less than a year old. What would be some effective tactics for local leaders to engage with their states?
Sometimes it's just getting in front of them. I mean, don't send your lobbyist. Pick up the phone and introduce yourself and talk with them. Some of these broadband offices are very new, and the folks were just hired and they have no idea what they're doing. And so they're trying, they want to learn from you. So tell them what your aspirations are, what your worries are, and just starting on a strategic plan can be helpful. So you know what your objectives and priorities are and you can frame them right. You need to know your community and your state. You can't start talking about digital equity if they get the heebie-jeebies if you use that term. So if it's something like digital opportunities is more palatable and that sort of rings true for them as a framework, then you need to know that, and you need to know that that's how you would frame it. But that should be within the context of what your objectives are. So are you trying to solve the infrastructure piece and just want to make sure that everybody has access no matter what type? Are you trying to tackle affordability? There's fixed wireless, but it's an older generation, and these antennas are incredibly expensive. And so, monthly subscription costs are like $120 per month just for basic, very, very slow speed service. Or as I said, it could be equity, of course. And the Capital Projects Fund certainly encourages you to map out where there are traditionally depressed areas and unfairly, unequally distributed resources to minority groups and map that out using just census. This is public data you can do. Sent from the Census Bureau to show some of these things. Are you trying to tackle economic development, remote learning, telehealth, or all of the above? If you have a sense of urgency because you really don't care about much of this stuff, of course it would be nice to have, but really you need those kids connected so they can do remote learning. That will flavor the kind of technology solutions you might adopt and or the type of partners you want to engage with. So these are, as you approach your broadband office, these are the things to keep in mind. The other thing to keep in mind, what is nice about kind of saying, here I am, here's my name, we're here, we're going to be talking with you for the next several years is, and I know this is close to Krista's heart and also Alex's, is this should not just be an effort, ideally, to solve this one problem. This should be an effort to build an institution. You should have, the community should have a broadband czar or contact person or whatever. Just because you have infrastructure does not mean that you have solved the issue of making sure that they did it correctly, and or that you have solved the affordability issue or the skills issue, etc. Those are still going to be there if you can help create institutional, a regional council, all organizational forms or titles, or like pressure the local government if they are not on board. Like, yes, but who is your broadband person? Who is the broadband? Who will be interviewed when a press release announces the big victory that you're going to have? Who would that be? Who would be responsible for making sure that you can ride that victory to your re-election campaign 2-4 years from now, right? And that gives you that digital equity piece in there, because that's going to be an issue for many years, and creative solutions will have to be developed without an enormous amount of federal funding being available to help. So this is where you put facts on the ground to leverage the process.
Alex, did you want to add to that?
No, that's great. That's a great answer. You know, I guess every state that, you know, we're working in, I think a dozen states at the moment, and they all have broadband offices at different stages of development. So check in early, check in often, ask them what's on their roadmap. What are they going to do? I mean, in some states, we've been told, yeah, we're going to launch a grant program, hopefully in 8 months. Okay, well, how does that factor into your planning you're doing now? So just be as communicative as you can and ask them what they're able to do to help, because some states have more resources, some have fewer, but they all should have something to offer.
Yeah, thank you so much. And so I heard, you know, loud and clear that the local community should articulate the local community's values. And we have a question in the chat from Kenneth that one of those values is including low-income families in accessibility. So I want to get to Kenneth's question, but to add a little bit of framing to it, you know, one of the features of the coming infrastructure bill, and also allowable under ARPA funding, although it requires a little agitation at the local level, is, you know, significant funding for digital inclusion and affordability, staffing digital navigator programs, or you know, a permanent subsidy benefit for you know, low-income households to connect affordably. This is included in the Digital Equity Act within the infrastructure bill, and LISC supports that on the record. $2.75 billion pending, you know, in grants for affordability, and also proposals to help states develop comprehensive plans to ensure equal access to the internet. So the idea of a digital inclusion statewide plan is contemplated in that. What direction would you offer our local stakeholders, you know, especially those that are really working on the front lines and have as clients these households that have been on the other side of digital divide? What suggestions do you have to help folks bake in digital inclusion, meaning access to devices, access to skill building, access to affordability, but really as part of the broadband infrastructure deployment or planning process?
So either of us can speak to that. I can say that what I would say is that we've increasingly tried to weave that in. So first of all, those are things that should be captured in a strategic plan. So you're articulating those values. In terms of the infrastructure piece itself, it's a little bit more difficult to weave it in, but we make sure when we create the term sheets and sort of the outline. Of course, we don't do contract, we're not lawyers, but we do create the framework for an RFP or a proposed RFP that the community then sort of turns into an official procurement document and later a contract. And we try to ask specifically, what are their low-income programs? Are they willing to throw in public housing, free Wi-Fi in public housing, or private housing with low-income tenants, or bulk buying where they chip in a big piece of that? What are their current discount programs? Are they willing to expand it? And what is the performance tier of it? I mean, if they have an affordable program, but it has data caps and it's, you know, doesn't even deliver 25.3 or barely, that's obviously not as good as, you know, we have a program for a flat fee of $40 or $50, but it gives 100 megabit per second, and you don't have to be eligible for anything to qualify. But then that becomes a wonderful target now for the broadband benefit program or similar type of program, because those costs could now be covered, and it could be a win-win situation for a provider to offer such a program if they don't already have it, a service plan if they don't already have it, and immediately get that covered by the federal government, either through the subscriber applying or through the ISP, applying credits or whatever. It depends how it's organized or structured. There are different programs are structured differently. But these are some of the places to weave that in. Put it in your criteria of evaluation. It's also a nice placeholder, but it's a nice thing to do so that you can show compliance with flexible funding sources. So if your jurisdiction may or may not have put funding aside from its general funds or from its local fiscal recovery funds pool of money. So every locality of a certain size and all counties got a certain allocation based on population and various other factors. So they got some money. They can deploy it to various different things, sewer, water, but also broadband. And many have elected to take a chunk of that and use it for those purposes. But the Capital Projects Fund says you have to take affordability into account. So why not put it in your RFP? Now you're covered. So if the funding source shifts, you're covered.
Yeah.
That's really helpful. And Alex, when you answer, I wonder if you could add, speak to a couple of comments we got in the chat, which is the idea of, hotspots as a temporary sort of patch to offer an affordable option to low income families. Hotspots use cellular networks for connectivity. Sometimes they work well, sometimes they don't. Is that the kind of strategy that should be written into these plans, or what would you say might go the distance as an alternative to achieve affordability and high quality connectivity?
Yeah, sure. Let me mention two other things and then get to that question so I don't forget them. I think in instances where we are helping municipalities or municipal entities build and own infrastructure, but lease it to a private provider to actually operate, that's an opportunity to build into the financial models a certain amount of revenue from the lease, essentially, that the municipality can put towards subsidizing service or subsidizing installations, because often that one-time cost is a barrier for people getting on the network, or even subsidizing kind of long drops to one-off installation costs that are challenging because of the subscriber's kind of situation. So if you're helping an entity build assets that are actually a recurring revenue source, then that's a great opportunity to try to build into that, some margin that allows you to make the service more accessible and equitably distributed. The other thing I would say is it's worth pushing for, at a moment like this, when there's a lot of money being controlled by municipalities, it's worth using that as leverage as much as you can and pushing for the kind of, affordability or equity or, kind of qualities that you want out of your service as much as possible. Not every provider will agree to net neutrality or will agree to transparent pricing, but in this instance where oftentimes municipalities have more leverage than ever before because they're controlling ARPA funds or whatever, it does provide a unique opportunity to push really hard and use those funds as leverage to achieve the outcomes that you want across equity issues. As to the hotspots, I think there is definitely a time and place for kind of individual hotspots. And we saw much more of this during the height of the pandemic when there was more remote schooling going on. With clients that were able to really aggregate demand, they actually also got a pretty good deal on the actual devices. That usually meant going through a government entity to procure those to address one of those questions in there. They definitely don't work. There's some benefits to them, right? You can give one to every student. You can give them out at school. They're mobile. So for children that have multiple households, they switch between parents or something like that, they can take them with them. There's definitely limitations to them. They don't have service everywhere. It's hard to fit more than one person on a Zoom call using them at the same time. So I wouldn't certainly consider them a long-term solution, but as an immediate stopgap, there's definitely a time and place for them. And, each jurisdiction is different, depending on whether AT&T or Verizon or T-Mobile has the best service there, especially in rural areas. There's often one provider that surpasses the others. So I don't know, Ziggy may have more to add about that, but we saw a wave of hotspot acquisition during the pandemic. And I think as was it Tony Pippa that was saying, now there's a little bit more of a focus on long-term infrastructure planning, but hotspots still have value for stopgap measures.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that hotspots are a very, very good temporary patch. I would add to the challenges of those is that if they came out of a education related funding source, there's often filtering on it because it has to be compliant with certain laws and rules regarding content, and that makes it virtually not unusable but difficult to use for other members of the household. And typically these units are also assigned at a household level, not at a student level. Mm-hmm. And so if you have a large household, you may only have one device for the entire household. That's problematic. And then finally, we're dealing with all the things we're always dealing with. Is this solution sustainable? Like, a year, 2 years from now, what do you have? Well, you don't have anything really. I mean, this is a temporary solution and it's really great for that. We've seen some projects, the projects for getting broadband to urban areas with multi-dwelling units, where there might be a lot of students and frankly, adults who need broadband desperately. The cities and municipalities and counties have been able, in some cases, to extend connectivity with sort of put an antenna on the roof type thing and do mesh wireless, put access points on each floor in lobby and hallways, etc. That certainly can work. Of course, when the county or city or private sponsor steps in with a free program, then you can't get it covered with emergency broadband benefit funds because the discount for $0 is $0. So what we now with this kind of funding available, there are things you can now do, as Alex intimated, there's the drops. Now you could fund in-building in-building wiring that is technology agnostic and vendor agnostic. That means you have all the pipes going into all the apartments and units ready to go, and you can bring in a drop cable from the street, or if that's too difficult and there really isn't a broadband provider right outside there, put that wireless antenna up on the roof with a one-to-one point-to-point connection, which can be very fast, and provide connectivity that way. These things can coexist if you have the infrastructure built in, and now it's eligible. And they weren't before.
Yeah, thank you for that. And this is a great moment, I think, to introduce two Ruralist partners and their successful digital navigator programs. And I'd like to invite you, Ziggy and Alex, to listen for ways that our digital navigator partners could lean further in and have their concrete successes in digital inclusion start to inform this longer term plan to get past temporary solutions into permanent solutions. So Emifa Butler with Choice in Uniontown, Alabama, and Matt Hyatt with Palmetto Care Connections in Bamford, South Carolina. Would love for you to take a minute or so each to talk about what you did with the Ruralist Digital Navigator program, and then invite Alex and Ziggy to kind of contextualize that against broadband planning opportunities. Matt, I see you on the screen, and hopefully Amifa, you're here too. Murat can spotlight you if you are, and can each take a turn.
All right, yeah, I'll talk about our program. So again, my name is Matt Hyatt. I'm the technology director at Palmetto Care Connections. We are a small nonprofit operate across South Carolina. We received a grant through LISC several months back. I can't remember exactly when we got the grant, but began working on a program with our senior citizens across 3 counties. The initial plan was to train and work with 50 seniors across those counties. But after investigating, after doing research, after working with service providers, we were able to train 65 senior citizens. And we worked with the Department on Aging and the Council on Aging to get these lists and to get these folks that were part of the literacy training. And these were the training was all done by digital navigators that went through the LISC and North Star program offered by LISC. But so we went out to those 3 counties, like I said, trained 65 senior citizens. We gave them a brand new tablet device. It's an Android tablet with a year's worth of cellular service on that device, as most of them that we were serving either did not have broadband available at their home, which we are working with them on and working with the local service providers on, or they couldn't afford it. A lot of those folks that were coming to us were low-income folks, as well as senior citizens and on a fixed income. So all the seniors received, all 65 seniors received, like I said, a tablet, a year's worth of service on that tablet. They received 3 2-hour training sessions where we went through things from how to set up email, how to send email, how to do a telehealth visit, how to have a video conference visit with your using Zoom is what we currently chose. But the idea was to empower them and show them this is the tool we're going to train you on here, but there are other tools and other ways, and just getting them to a comfort level where they're comfortable going and getting those other applications and starting to engage with family and friends. So those were the things we worked on. There's a whole litany of other apps and other things we work with them just to bring a comfort level to them. But 25 years of doing IT between K through 12, higher ed, and healthcare, this was by far probably the most rewarding project I've ever worked on with these 65 seniors, and being able to spend time with them, bring something to them that they never thought they would have or could have before, and access to them. So it was a great project, and we look forward to more like it in the future.
Thank you for sharing that, and congratulations on your success. And I'm glad it was so meaningful for you all. And yeah, Alex, would love to hear your thoughts on kind of contextualizing these digital adoption strategies within a expanded broadband access agenda.
Yeah, I'm thoroughly impressed. That sounds like a really great program. I think what it speaks to is that the real value or ROI, if you will, to a community that comes from expanding broadband really only can take place if as many people are using it and building digital skills as possible. And just in those examples you gave, everyone who saves a trip to the hospital, reduces wear on their car, doesn't have to buy gas, feels less socially isolated, feels more socially connected. Everyone who you can kind of empower to achieve those things with their broadband access, that is an incremental but meaningful impact to the community. And so especially when you're empowering people to either volunteer or help out their community, just it creates a nice ripple effect that's really maximizing the value of that infrastructure.
Yeah, just one thing to highlight that I should have highlighted. And we really didn't know it when we were doing the training. You talk about traveling and saving wear and tear and saving time, but we had in one of the trainings we had a 90 something or right at 90-year-old senior citizen who was a heart transplant recipient and was trying to, she had to go back and forth to MUSC, one of the academic medical facilities here in the state, for visits. But they are very on board with telehealth. All their departments, for the most part, are doing telehealth. So now she can have those visits via telehealth because of the device that she has in her home and the training she went through. So that's just one of several, great stories from the group of folks that we worked with.
And Matt, Dakota asks if your training for the seniors was in a one-on-one setting or in a group setting.
We did them in a group setting. We did 10 to 12 at a time. So we would do 2 sessions in a day for a couple hours. So now the final session we did end up doing it with 20 seniors in the room. It was a very large room at a local church that we had arranged the room with. So it was a very large auditorium, and we're able to keep everybody safe. And then we had what we call floaters. They had all gone through the digital navigator training that would take a table, for instance. So not necessarily one-on-one, but we'd have 3, maybe 4 people at the most at a table. And we would have a floater that kind of hung out around each table. So when they had individual questions, we could address them. So, the instructor didn't have to stop and spend an enormous amount of time with one individual. So we could get through everything.
Very good. Thank you. Well, are there any other questions for Matt? I did see another question in the chat that returns us to the broadband infrastructure topic. But Matt, you're going to stay on for a minute.
Yep. Thank you.
Good. Okay. And let's see. You got to thank you that was clarifying. Don, I'd love to come back to your question about the ARPA monies and the infrastructure bill seeming to favor support for cooperatives. I assume you mean electric power cooperatives and their role as internet service providers. Alex and Ziggy, do you have a thought about that, especially in the rural context where those providers already have relationships, with the community?
So just to be clear, this is not, so the ARPA funds are not in and of themselves. So the local fiscal recovery funds, oh, why am I so blurred suddenly? I don't feel very blurred. The ARPA funds, local fiscal recovery, do not have any strong strings attached. So, Treasury can say what it wants in terms of prefer electric co-op or municipal public funded solutions. And their chief rationale is that without a profit motive, there's a natural inclination to want to extend solutions equally across an entire community. And that's why this might be a better model, but there's no way to enforce it, or there's no scoring. The funding is here, you have the funding, you decide what to do with it. We suggest that you prefer, but these are suggestions, they're not enforceable in any way. But the logic that they captured is something to keep in mind. You can shift that logic if you design your RFP and your contracts well. And this is why it's so important to have the good mapping done. So you know exactly where the gaps are, and you make sure that the entire community is covered. So this is an awful blur.
I can hear you clearly though.
Yeah. But I think one thing that maybe helps create the perception that co-ops are being favored is that there are a lot of states that have, over the past few years or 5 years rolled back regulations prohibiting electric co-ops from participating in broadband. And so there's actually been quite a number of them that are now participating in ways they haven't before, whether, there was a consortium of co-ops that won money in the RDOF auction. There are particular states, we're working in Tennessee for one, where the legislature allowed co-ops to provide broadband services 4 or 5 years ago, and since then, over half of them have started doing so, and they are obligated to provide that service to every customer within their footprint. And so there is a lot of investment being made by co-ops and resources going to them to fill these very challenging, sparsely populated rural areas.
And there's another logic specifically to electric co-ops, and that is that they can deploy, if they decide to do so, they can deploy cost effectively and relatively quickly. They own the poles, and they are already at the customers with service. So, stringing fiber on their own poles going into the very customer they are already there with, and they don't have to invent a new sales department or a new. They already have expertise for how to do cable, and most of them have some of their own fiber anyway for their own purposes. So it's not a huge lift for many of them. Some of them are nervous about the financials and are very wary of sort of dipping their feet into the broadband waters. And so some of them have said, we like the idea, but we're not willing to take the risk. But we're happy to have a private partner provide that. We essentially use our infrastructure, use our footprint, use our connections, etc. And they build it out for us and they operate it. And either they or we will own it, or we'll half own it, or whatever. They'll come to some kind of resolution. So basically they're shifting the risk away, but still providing the benefit. So there are multiple models that are possible, and they were reflected in the RDOF auction, which saw not one, but several electric co-op consortia.
Well, I'd love to invite the audience to ask additional questions or share stories. You can unmute, use your video if you'd care to, or put questions in the chat. We want to approximate being together in person as much as possible. And we do have about 20 minutes left of the session. So would love to invite folks to get their questions in while we have Alex and Ziggy. Well, while we're waiting for folks to formulate their questions, Ziggy and Alex, I wonder if you'd comment a little bit more on public-private partnerships as models for deployment of this infrastructure, and potentially even for the the digital inclusion, workforce development, kind of follow-on value add component as well. Oh, and I see Wiley, so we'll call on you next, Wiley. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean. And there are on the infrastructure side, you've got several different elements. You've got design, build, own, operate, and any of those 4 pillars can go to a different entity. When you partner with an ISP in many of these arrangements that are typical these days, basically you're giving the ISP a whole bunch of money, or you are funneling. It may not be your money, right? It may be grant funds, funding funds to the ISP to do all 4. Like, all right, we're going to give you money. We don't want to have this headache. We don't want the infrastructure. We just want you to worry about it. We already know that you are participating in a market. We know that this is the logic of what you do and you can do it effectively. We don't want to get in your way. That is certainly one approach. Another is we have our own internal needs. We have anchor institutions that must be connected, and lots of them. We have fire stations, we have hospitals, we have all kinds of places that must get better connectivity. And so frankly, we want to own that infrastructure, but we'd rather not do the residential services that, we're a government and we don't feel comfortable doing that piece of it. And so you can then enter into partnerships where, they either lease your part of the infrastructure, especially the piece that will go to your buildings, etc., and public housing, for example. Those pieces will be owned by the local government. They will own the rest. Or there are all kinds of variations on this. And these are all the kinds of things that you flesh out before you design your RFP to match what you're trying to achieve. You really don't want to create an RFP that says, please come up with a creative solution for how to solve this problem, because you'll get exactly 0 bidders on it. Because writing an RFP response is really intensive work. It takes a lot of person hours, which means lots of money. And nobody's going to do that unless they think there's a good chance that there is, some opportunity down the line that is real, and spinning wheels is not real. So we either do these, and Alex does the same in his group, like we do informal outreach and or a formal RFI to figure out what are the markets, what is possible, knowing what we already as a community determined we want. We want to own this infrastructure, or we don't trust ISPs. We're going to operate it. And so our strategic plan needs a much, much more in-depth financial analysis because we're taking on the financial risk. So we really need to know what are some of the conservative take rates which we should be projecting based on current market players and conditions. What is kind of the sweet spot of what we can afford to charge before, and most people will pick up that service. But beyond that, they start dropping off saying this is too expensive, but we don't want to price it too cheap because we want to break even, not in 20 years, but in 7 years, etc. That kind of analysis is then critical. And there are all kinds of other things that then attend to that, because now you have to absorb all these other risks. We see it, and there are definitely communities that are very passionate about this. They feel that broadband is a critical utility and should not be up to the private marketplace to dictate. It is simply too critical to leave it up to profit motive. And they feel very strongly about that. And some of them are even willing to take on a financial debt that they might carry for a while. So I didn't answer the stuff about the sort of layering on the affordability and equity language and the digital navigator programs, etc. But it is a good opportunity to, in your discussions with potential private partners, if that is how you're going to do this in these different types of partnership, to say, how about we sit together and develop a program together? Because guess what? If we can come up with a way to train people, to educate them, to find additional funding for them to participate, that translates in a higher take rate for you. That's money in your pockets. So please work with us, right?
Yes, good message there. I appreciate that.
And I'm becoming increasingly blurry. I feel like I'm in a Woody Allen movie now.
Well, we can hear you clearly, and folks will
That's good.
have the recording and can rely on the audio portion. Alex, did you have anything you wanted to add about public-private partnerships?
No, that was great. That was very thorough. I think at the end of the day, public involvement, the goal of that and the purpose of that is to devise a solution that meets public policy goals, whether that is reaching every single person in a jurisdiction so that you don't have to worry about the infrastructure ever again, whether that's ensuring there's an affordability component, whether that's finding a way to incorporate digital skill building into the process. That is the power of a public-private partnership. And I think it's promising that public-private partnerships are more common and more viable than ever, given the amount of funding that's flowing directly to municipalities or in their control, coupled with the rollback of regulations against municipalities being involved in broadband or owning infrastructure, which are happening across the country. So that in a nutshell is why I think it's so important.
Thank you. Wiley, go ahead, please.
Sure, thank you. And I have to apologize because I did miss the first part of today's presentation. So I'm in Berkshire County in Massachusetts. And we have, I work on economic development. So at least from a starting point, while absolutely digital equity, telehealth, services to children, of course, are incredibly important. At least the frame that I'm starting from for today is just the economic development piece. And I just sent one link that is a private group that is working on looking at broadband access for remote work, right? Because a lot of people moved up here during the pandemic. We'd like to keep those people here, as well as encourage more businesses to set up here. And if we don't have strong broadband, that's not going to happen. So I guess I'm just trying to understand getting, we have 32 towns. They all have are all in very different places in the process. What advice you might have, or if there's again a best practice model that not just working with one town, but like working with 13 plus 32 plus towns to kind of come together on a complex issue like this, when all of them may be coming at it from different perspectives. And then earlier in the chat, I think I just showed this FCC broadband coverage map, which I'm sure is fairly non-specific, wanting in terms of its accuracy. So how do we start to really get a handle on where our coverage gaps are?
Yeah, let me take this one and Ziggy can jump in. So one of the biggest challenges in rural areas is gaining the efficiencies of scale and kind of aggregating density to some extent that allows projects to become viable. So I think you have the right instincts there, thinking about, do we have to take these towns one by one, or can we kind of aggregate or group them together in a way that makes the projects more viable, makes the margins a little bit better and increases the efficiency, both from the building and operations standpoint, but also the planning standpoint. So you may know this already, but a lot of your neighboring states, including Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine, are pushing a model, like a district model, whether that Vermont calls it communication union districts, New Hampshire calls it communication districts, and Maine, I think, is a kind of utilities district. And what that does is it allows towns to work together as though they were a single municipal entity. If Massachusetts doesn't have a framework like that, you can do a similar thing, I think, with kind of interlocal contracts, or maybe you could do it at a county level. But essentially, the idea is that the towns all work together. They plan together. Usually, they each appoint a representative to a kind of decision-making body that just allows them to kind of efficiently move forward as a group. So I think you're absolutely right on that. And some states, especially the more rural ones, have tried to create structures that make that process more efficient. And then when it comes to kind of actually mapping your infrastructure, the FCC maps are really too, they're not good enough to do planning based on that data, frankly. There's too much error in the map. Usually the areas that have coverage are overstated in the FCC data, but that's not even always uniform. And we've certainly worked in places where the FCC greatly understated where the coverage was. So typically you have to supplement that data with one of a number of kind of processes, and it kind of depends on the context, which is the most efficient to use. But some people really push kind of community surveys where people take a speed test, they record where their address is, they record what type of infrastructure they have at their house. And that's useful for the planning process, but there are also some funding sources like the USDA that will take that data and allocate resources based on that idea of coverage versus the FCC idea of coverage. But there are real challenges with that. Usually it only works if you've got a lot of volunteers ready, like willing to push the survey out to get a big sample size. You can also essentially drive around, marking what's on the polls. I think CTC and Ziggy can maybe speak to that because that's something they have done in different jurisdictions. You can also, it never hurts to ask the providers if they would be willing to share their coverage data. They rarely do. Some states have codified kind of RFI processes like New Hampshire, where municipalities are allowed to basically request that information from providers. And if they don't supply it, there's a penalty. So at the end of the day, you have to augment the data, the FCC data, with some other mechanism for understanding where coverage is. And it really just depends on the context, what would be most efficient. I think even another path is to do a Google Street View survey where, somebody has a bunch of interns and they, go walk around on Google Street Views of looking at the polls and recording what the infrastructure is there. So it really depends.
So I love these solutions, but I have to insert again my pitch, which is that the Ruralist program is seeking to fund these activities so you don't have to rely on interns or willing volunteers, but in fact help you sort of stitch together some of those essential components of pre-development, including mapping, and help you pay for it. So if that's something of interest, please get in touch with me. And I noticed that Alex and both shared their contact information as well. So thank you for that. But not to steal your thunder, Ziggy, did you have anything further that you wanted to add about mapping techniques or pre-development in general?
We do. I don't know that I need to go into it. But you have to be trained to do this. But training is not rocket science, and it can be done. But we have. We make mistakes too, and we have really experienced engineers. It's not always easy to figure out what is up on those poles. And we are doing two things. We're trying to figure out where is their broadband infrastructure that is residential. You can't just take fiber and assume that provides connectivity to a house. It could be, a private fiber, for some corporation somewhere. So you have, that's one part of it. But the other part is to do an assessment of what the conditions are so that you can incorporate that into an RFI or RFP or both, and so that you have a sanity check. Because one of the first things you need to do is figure out what's the order of magnitude of my problem. Is it a $2 million problem or is it an $80 million problem? My political stakeholders will want to know. If you have like you're talking about all these independent townships, is it something that the county can find the funds, or really to make this work, there has to be some, even if it's modest, some participation from the townships as well in any, so they have skin in the game as well. They will be motivated to help figure out where their gaps are, and they could potentially help. I did want to address that multi-jurisdiction governance piece. I think it's important. We have a client, Washtenaw County, Michigan, Washtenaw is essentially made up of townships. They look funky because it's like squares. But what we did was we designed an RFP that allowed respondents to answer by township and as a whole. And we made it clear that we would negotiate in multi-award settings and draw boundaries based on a variety of factors, including per passing costs. And the expectation was that this would allow us to go to those townships and say, your match will be X if you want to participate because you have this amount of addresses. In the end, the county stepped up and said, no worries, we'll fund it with our ARPA funds. We'll still go for capital projects funds and others if we can get it, but we will set money aside. It's important enough that it needs to be handled at the county level.
Yeah,
But
and we're even more. So we're even more complicated because we don't have a county government. So our organization
okay.
sort of serves as that. Yeah.
Yeah, you can still, so we have jurisdictions that got together to create an RFP. What you don't need to create a formal governance as a compact or basically an entity that can take on debt and procurement processes and risks, etc. What you can simply have the very same thing I just outlined with an RFP. You'll have like a broadband committee that has representations that would work with a consultant. And when the RFP released, it's on behalf of all the townships, but it is one of the townships that sponsors it. If you have a nonprofit or governmental economic development agency that crosses these borders, they can also, right, so you could do the RFI, you could probably not do the RFP, because unless you have a ride-sharing arrangements where your contract is something that the other jurisdictions can ride, so you wouldn't be executing it, or you would be executing it formally, but there's no money attached, and they would be doing it. But it sounds a little cumbersome. It sounds much more feasible to have one of the jurisdictions step up to volunteer, and then everybody will essentially, after selection or whatever, a negotiation phase, then they can like do the separate negotiation with the partner to draw up the contract, and of course you'd have pretty much the same contract, but it will be customized.
And Ziggy, can I ask you a question? And with in situations like that where you have multi-jurisdictional projects that aren't that don't have a contract to kind of consolidate them, does it ever work out that each individual town owns part or some of the infrastructure in their own town, or is this a model where it really only works if they're kind of supplementing the resources to build, but it's the private entity that ends up owning the infrastructure?
Yeah, we had one client that tried to do it, but there was just, the problem was that there was no single viable model because each township had different philosophies on this. So given that, a more traditional public-private partnership that they could either then jump onto or not became more viable. It's theoretically possible, but it would be difficult to do. Yeah. I mean, they all have to be on the same page, and that's almost, yeah. I don't see how that could happen. There was in Washtenaw County, there was one of the township that had decided to build out their own infrastructure and had funded it prior to this, so they were pretty much already served. But everybody else, were like, please solve this problem for us. we don't need to be that engaged and involved. If we have to come up with some funds, let us know and we'll do our best. But, you know, that certainly made it easier with a county government. That's not what they have here.
Right.
So here they have to have a task force that will take this on and a sponsoring procuring jurisdiction.
I'm so glad we got into a dynamic dialogue here at the end, but just about a minute left. So unless there are any final burning questions, we can continue this conversation offline. And I certainly hope that we do. And please get in touch with me at cvinson@list.org or my colleague Liz Lima at elima@list.org. She's our digital equity fellow. And Mifa, I see that you've joined us and would certainly love to give you an opportunity to share your story. I don't think we'll get in any trouble if we go at about a minute over, but don't want to put you on the spot. We were just wrapping up.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I was actually in another Zoom and I was like, I don't see anybody and I don't hear familiar conversation. So my apologies for not paying attention to it, but the presentation over there was good. And I'm sure this one was even better. So I definitely will not prolong the time, but definitely wanted to show our gratitude and appreciation here at Choice for having the opportunity to participate in the Digital Navigator program with Ruralist so that we can provide technical resources to our community around broadband and other technical capabilities that we struggle to have access to. And for the sake of introduction, CHOICE is an acronym for Choosing to Help Others in Our Community Excel. And we are a resource-based organization by which we create collaborative partnerships to offer charitable and educational resources in our community in 6 key areas, which includes education, workforce development, health and wellness, mentoring, athletic and recreation, and arts. Our primary target audience for our programs are mostly our youth and our senior community. However, we do serve everyone who wish for us to be a resource to them. And when we had the opportunity to participate in the Digital Navigator program, it was very important to us because it was during the time of COVID when our school system was remote. And we identified that there's more households than norm that do not have the access in order for their students to have a less stressful, if you may, journey around remote access. And so what we did in partnership with Ruralist is use the funding that we had to focus not only on the availability of broadband services in our area, but focus more on accessibility. And those are, here's the 3 A's that we really look at when we're talking about bringing resources into the community or creating those partnerships. We look at availability, accessibility, and affordability. We don't charge for any of the services that we provide here at the Choice Resource Center because we understand the community by which we're serving. And yes, most say it's a poverty-driven community, but I challenge that to suggest that we are a talented-driven community that lack the resources to come out of where we are. And so with technical programs, technical resources to get so that people can get access to the resources that's available, we need broadband. And I know there are a lot of initiatives out there that is focusing on bringing better broadband to the community, but sometimes communities as small as Uniontown kind of get left out of the puzzle. So ultimately, we just want to be that voice to say that Uniontown welcomed the opportunity for a stronger broadband connection, because with the availability of a strong broadband connection, then ultimately we can access the resources that we need in order to come from where we are right now. And then when you look at affordability, and this is the one great thing that I feel came out of the funding that Ruralist provided is most households could not afford the broadband access that was available to them. Some people were able to participate in some of the discounted programs, but they were still paying over $50 a month, right? And there are some people who are paying over $100 a month for fixed wireless service. And just to kind of think about it in a sense, probably should turn your stomach up, right? And so what we partnered with TechSoup and other other providers in order to get access to hotspots. And we put those hotspots in the houses because we had identified what would work in that community, because we had purchased the various providers service in order to allow the families to test them out. And then there's one thing to have access. So you have access to the technology, but do you know how to use it, right? And so we have a great partnership with some of our student fellows, and they went out into the community to ensure that the households understood how to use the access that we were providing to them. What we were able to identify is that there are tablets, there are laptops in some of the homes, but it's beyond accessing the internet and having the equipment. We have to train. And so we created a digital training program that encompasses the software that Ruralist provided to us through their grant funding with North Star, as well as a resource that we learned while participating in a digital navigator program called Goodwill. So not only was my staff and I able to hone in on our digital skills, but we were able to introduce those resources, those training resources to the community. And right now, we just finished our student training, which was 8 weeks, and we're in our second week of our senior training, our senior citizens who are over 60, and there's 6 of them, and they're learning well and having fun. And so again, like I said, I don't want to take up so much of the time, but definitely wanted to share how we've been able to be a resource to our community through Ruralist and their digital navigator program. And ultimately, we welcome any of you to build relationships and create partnerships so that we can learn how you could be a resource to us here in Uniontown, Alabama, that sits in Perry County.
Wow. Well, I love that very inspiring note to end on and to layer on top of this extremely informative session. So thank you so much, Amitha, and thank you, Ziggy and Alex, for that incredible wealth of information that I know is going to empower our partners like Amitha and others in the room today to charge forward and to do this important work. And Liz would be honored to be at your side to do that. So thank you very, very much for being here today, and let's have the conversation continue offline. We'll see each other again soon.